Welcome to Climate Majority Thinks. Welcome to our latest webinar with Steve Markley and others. The way this is going to work is that myself, Rupert Reed, and my co-director, Liam Kavanagh, will have some exchange with Steve Markley, author of The Deluge, who I'll introduce properly in a minute. And then there'll be a chance for one or two questions to Steve before he has to head off at about 10 or quarter past the hour. After Steve goes, we'll carry on the webinar for another half an hour or so, segueing more deeply into questions of adaptation as a response to what has happened over the past week or two. And then we'll have a final word from Chantal Burns towards the end, who some of you will have seen in the first webinar in this mini-series around the election, which was exactly a fortnight ago. And the link to that video, if you haven't already seen it, will be put in the chat. At the end also, we'll have one or two announcements of upcoming events, so do stay tuned for those. That's both online and in-person events that the Climate Majority Project is putting on. So I'm going to now turn to introducing Steve Markley. Steve will be known to some of you as the author of The Deluge. Here is The Deluge. It is thick enough to stun an ox, as they say, and worth every page of it. It's prescient in a number of alarming ways. It didn't quite tragically, or perhaps not so tragically, foresee what happened last week, but it did foresee things that were similar, or in some cases worse. And that's one of the credentials for bringing Steve to this call. It is, for those of you who don't know it, an absolutely astonishingly brilliant epic novel of climate politics and climate action in our time, set in the United States. So this is why we wanted to talk to Steve in relation to what's just happened in the United States. So I'm now going to plunge in and start asking Steve one or two questions, which will be perhaps unsurprising to you, the nature of those questions. The question I'd like to start with is to ask Steve how he's doing. And the reason I'm going to ask that question is that for, I think, probably everybody on this call, this election result has been pretty horrendous and shocking, at least in some of its details, even if not in its broad outline. The fact that Trump won the popular vote, the fact that he's won control of Congress, things like that. It is really a ferocious result and will give the Republicans untrammeled power over the coming years, at least the next couple of years. So for pretty much all of us on this call, what happened a week ago today was awful. But it seems clear to me that it is another order of magnitude worse for people who are actually in the United States, on the ground, as it were, and dealing with this as citizens and as residents. So, Steve, I want to ask my first question to you, which is, how are you doing? How are you handling this? How's it all landing with you? And we'd love your frank response, because that's a central currency for us here in the Climate Majority Project.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to take a break from my typical post-election activity of screaming into a pillow to be here with y'all. So that's like mostly what I felt like doing. But yeah, you know, it's one of those things where I am both not at all surprised and totally shocked, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
A few weeks beforehand, I was really beginning to sort of understand in my emotional, core that this was not only possible, but looked, somewhat likely given the polls. And still on election night, I think like everybody else, I was like pretty blown away. And yeah, and it's just been trying to sort of wrap my head around it, come to terms with it, and think, especially in my little corner of all of this, like what can I do to sort of alleviate what's about to happen, I think is the best way to put it.
Yeah. Let me ask the same question sort of again in terms of the Deluge. So we're not going to do spoilers tonight.
Yeah.
But most people will probably be aware, even if they haven't read it, that the Deluge is a full-on account of the next 20 years or so. That a lot of really awful things happen in it, as well as some good things. And yet, this is one of the moments in which truth has already, it seems, outpaced fiction. You didn't have anything quite as bad as this election result coming in the 2020s. I think it would be fair to say in the
Yeah.
novel.
Well, like with
So
most of the novel, go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was just going to say, how does that feel to you? And does that lend you kind of an extra dose of pessimism about where we're now headed?
Yeah, well, like with most of the novel, it's just the only thing I really got wrong is how much faster it's all happening. I
Mm,
had this
mm,
feeling this summer when I was watching this hurricane, basically vaporize a city in North Carolina that I, love and that I've been to many times before. I'm talking about Asheville, of course.
mm.
Uh, and not this is hopefully not too much of a spoiler, but at the end of the novel, a similar situation happens that destroys North Carolina. uh, and it's one of those things where like the parallels to the book are just so uh, intense. And then when something like this happens, you're just like, well, I guess it's all the timeline is much more accelerated than we all think, and that includes some of the things I'm really starting to get worried about, which is the U.S. insurance market and how that's beginning to look from a place where I was like speculatively thinking about this in 2010, and now suddenly it's getting much more concerning.
Yeah. So one of the again, being careful not to do outright spoilers, but
Yeah.
something that I'm very interested in is the way that in your novel you think about the way in which insurance and questions about serious questions about adaptation are actually instrumental to a potential shift in mindset and in politics in the US. Do you see any basis at all for thinking that anything like that could be about to happen on an accelerated timetable in the next few years? In other words, how might things look, for example, if Trump and his minions face, horrendous headwinds which they do nothing about in the next year or two? Do you think that we could see some kind of, is it possible that there might be some kind of massive shift that starts to come, say, I don't know, around the time of the midterms in a couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I am well out of the business of political prognostication.
Yeah.
However, I do think that just because a bunch of people who won this election don't believe in the reality we're living in, doesn't mean that reality won't continue to impact us and
Yes.
them, right? And there's no telling what way any of this might go, and that's one of the most frightening things about it. I think any standard Republican administration, certainly any Democratic administration, you know the parameters of what's possible and where you're headed, and at least there's comfort in that. And one of the things about Trumpism is just how outside of any predictive norms we can even like use. We don't have a framework for it.
Yeah.
At the same time, that also means I think there are more opportunities to make progress on climate and to perhaps find those game changing moments, those wedges into our politics and our economy that can perhaps begin to turn the situation around.
You think that because of the way that 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 Trump and his Republican allies will get some things so wrong or do things that are so unpredictable that they create opportunities in their way, whether they mean to or not. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yeah, well, that and just like the nature of that coalition is so bizarre. It's
Yeah.
not just standard, sort of, people trying to cut taxes for billionaires, although that's a big faction of it, and they will do more of that, right? But there's all these other people now who are in a constellation around him that believe diametrically opposed things. Just for example, Musk and RFK, Robert Kennedy Jr., who are two of the most bizarre people to like end up in a Republican administration I could ever imagine. Um, so
Mm,
again, like I have no predictions to make at all.
sure.
But also when it comes to even our Joe Biden's big climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act, maybe a few months ago, people would have been like, that's done. But already you're seeing coming out of the woodwork, Republicans saying like, well, except for all of the tax credits that help my district, except for all of the tax credits that, these manufacturing plants rely on. And so there's this way in which like there is more opportunity to save a lot of that bill than I think a lot of people understand at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. I'll hand over to Liam for his thoughts and questions in a moment. But before I do that, one more crucial question. Imagining that there could be very serious opportunities for non-Republicans and non-Trump in 2 years, in 4 years, because of the chaotic way that Trump is likely to govern, because of the tremendous headwinds that they're going to be facing into. What are you and the people, including I know some, very kind of well-placed people around you, and perhaps also people who you've been kind of allying with in the past couple of months as you try to do a little bit to influence the course of the election. What are people who you are in touch with or close to thinking or feeling about the prospects for American democracy? How secure do you think it is? How secure does it feel to you right now in the United States? If Trump and his allies are in danger of losing in 2 years or in 4 years, will that actually be possible insofar as you can tell at this early stage?
Yeah, I mean, this is as insecure as it's ever been in my lifetime. That's absolutely for sure. And what we'll know because not to get too deep into U.S. Political machinations, but basically you can't pass anything at all without 60 votes in the Senate, which the Republicans do not have. Right? You can pass stuff through budget reconciliation, but that only affects taxes and spending. That's how the IRA got passed. If the Republicans were to do something like remove the filibuster, then I think it would be that's the time to panic. For years, Democrats have been sort of or progressives, liberals, everyone has been like, we should get rid of the filibuster, which because it slows progress, it stops, Congress from doing what the majority of people want them to do, but it also is insurance against autocrats. So if the Republicans were to do something like that, remove the filibuster, then I think it's a five-alarm fire, all hands on deck. Everybody get as scared as possible. Without that, they're going to be able to pass basically one enormous like fuck up the budget bill, basically. And then in 2 years we'll have the next round of elections, at which point hopefully we can begin to put more guardrails in place on this guy. But this is all speculative right now. Like I'm ready to be as maximally terrified and I'm ready to be as sanguine as possible. You know what I mean? Like we don't really know yet. But there are certain key
Sure,
indicators that I'll
sure.
be looking for. Yeah.
But it sounds like what you're saying or feeling is that you are not as scared as some people are that Trump and the Republicans are going to try to eviscerate democracy by way of getting secretaries of state and et cetera, in place who in any future, even remotely narrow election, are going to try to steal the election. You don't see that as a probability for the midterms or the next presidential election?
I mean, I am ready for all like every kind of fuckery you can imagine, right? But I just think the mechanisms, the on the ground mechanisms of controlling elections, of spoiling votes, et cetera, all of that is a lot more difficult than just like putting in place a secretary of state or a secretary of whatever who's going to do this or that or the other.
Mhm.
And so what we should be looking at is all those like little indicators. I mean, like now, I mean, right now, and frankly, this has been very frustrating to me. I have heard a lot of chatter from liberals and progressives about like, well, was this election stolen? Blah 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 blah. Like anytime people don't like the outcome in the United States, they claim the
Mm.
election was stolen, or they hope it was, because it explains why their worldview makes sense, right? Um, and so I'm not ready to be panicking about that yet, but I will get back to you if I decide to start panicking about it based on specific indicators. Yeah.
Liam, over to you.
Well, I think the natural follow-up question is, what indicators are you looking for right now? Like, what are you scanning the news, waiting for at the current moment?
Well, I mean, any indication that there's this guy, John Thune, he's going to probably be leader of the Senate. He is, not a great human being, I'm sure, but like he's an institutionalist. Like he's a long time member of the Senate. He's not like a Trump lackey right wing nut. If he were to suddenly get a challenge from one of these like very frightening senators, that would be something I would worry about. Again, if they started talking about removing the filibuster, that's when I think it really is like all hands on deck, alarm bells ringing, right? And I know this is like sounds catastrophizing to even bring up, but like whoever's Secretary of Defense, that person, is right next to Donald Trump when we're talking about nuclear weapons and that issue. I still, one of the scariest parts of his first term, in my opinion, was this is a man who is like probably the last person you want next to nuclear arms in history. I put him up there with like anybody as someone you don't want to have access to those. Well, now he does. So, the people in those roles around him, I think are going to be vital, and we should be paying attention to that.
Yeah, okay. So here's another question for you. So I don't think everybody in the call knows who Kate Morris is, but we can just probably spoil that much. She's extremely charismatic founder and leader of a kind of climate movement, which has some kind of similarities to CMP in that it's trying to go mainstream. That she's appealing beyond the normal bubble. What would Kate Morris do? What in terms of, because there's political prognostication, and then there's simply seeing crisis as opportunity. We see a huge loss of faith in the establishment right now. Huge fissures in the Democratic Party, a number of publications declaring wokeism dead, including both the Atlantic and the New York Times, and also Morning Joe. So these are kind of like three sort of major organs of liberal or establishment liberal, or even progressive media, essentially saying, yeah, it's enough with virtue signaling. We have to get serious now. As one of the first messages of the election, those are huge changes.
Yeah.
What do we think is going to actually, what opportunities in crisis would Kate Morris see right now?
That's a really good question. I think that to some extent what differentiated Kate from like a lot of and I was very intentional when I was writing the book about this, like looking at the issue outside of the realms of what can this do for my individual bubble and group identification, right? Like how can we make the climate movement the movement of the majority, not to pander to my audience? And this is a huge problem. And I really don't want to name names here because I am always, anybody who wants to do anything about this problem, like God bless them. And like whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I just think there have been groups that have been, even if they create initial enthusiasm, become counterproductive because they are unable to talk to anybody outside of their bubble, outside of their closed circuit. This is a huge issue with the climate movement in that, frankly, and this probably addresses a lot of people on this call. We are mostly educated, semi affluent to comfortable people who have the time and the privilege to sort of focus our attention on this issue. And that's tough because then that's the only people you're talking to. It's difficult to form a political majority. Now, speaking to like what's changed in the US in the last 2 years, I'll again go back to what the IRA has done, which already out the door, $500 billion of money. And that means like steel in the ground, manufacturing and tax incentives across the country in every Republican district as well as Democratic, right? And so I think that creates the opportunity to build unlikely alliances, not with people who are going to suddenly turn and vote for Democrats, but people who are going to say, wait, this battery plant in my district, like we cannot do anything to mess with that, right? That is what I think the movement right now should be absolutely focused on, is keeping up the momentum behind clean energy, because it broadens the scope of people who are interested in solutions. That to me is something that's going to be key over the next few years, is sort of driving a wedge into the Republican Party around this issue. And just to sorry, I could talk about this for another, like, where Trump is getting so much of his financing and his political power and momentum from is sort of people like who have businesses in my district, which are sort of small, or where my hometown, small gas producers, small oil and gas producers, who are creating so much of the financial and sort of like the vicious energy behind Trumpism. It is a phenomenon of the last gasp of the fossil fuel economy. I really believe that. And, he had these oil and gas executives visit him at Mar-a-Lago, where he basically promised to do whatever they wanted for, in exchange for $1 billion for his campaign. So, the stitching, the tethering between Trump and fossil fuel interests, to me, is like as tight as can be. And so, again, finding those wedges, finding those ways to crack up that majority right now is vital.
Yeah, right. And you'd probably agree also, waiting for mistakes, that Trump was, by all accounts of his seconds or appointees in his first term, full of mistakes. He may very well make some very serious ones that probably, we could be waiting for. Yeah, I think another question may be, the Democratic Party totally disorganized right now. There's a lot of talk about how they need all new types of candidates, that it needs a lot more people who are in trades, a lot more people who are comfortable talking to working class audiences, that they essentially need to speak new languages, that it has become, this kind of thing that you've heard in the past, that it's become the party of the educated, has abandoned, middle America, is being said in quarters or openly in a way that I don't think it has ever been said. So if the Democrats were actually to follow through on that, is that potentially the kind of sea shift that we need to happen in order to get somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, and I don't want, like, everybody running around right now saying, like, well, what Kamala Harris said on The View cost her the election, like all that crap, like I have no interest in. Like this, there's so much like Monday morning quarterbacking going on that I just think is like so silly to be worried about. But over the long term, I'll never forget this quote in 2020. And I forget the guy's name who wrote this, but he was basically saying, like, look at the way even in Black and Latino neighborhoods, working class voters are shifting towards Trump. Like, this is really scary. And in this election, that just like exploded, right? And so basically, the Republicans, or Trumpism, they have built the working class majority voting bloc that Democrats always claim to want to build, right? Which is both frustrating and probably not that surprising. And I do think that, especially over the last, let's say, 14-ish years, 12 years, the focus on sort of like, for lack of a better word, wokeism or identity politics, the concerns of an educated class of people who work within the Democratic Party, who come from elite institutions, Yale, Harvard, wherever else, that thinking has basically turned the Democratic Party into a party that can only speak about those issues. And when it comes to actually like engaging with people's quote unquote, I hate this term, but I'll use it anyway, pocketbook issues, they even if their policies are better than the Republicans, they have absolutely no way of engaging with that audience, right? And that leaves open all this room to like utter charlatans to come in and sort of claim the mantle of the working class. And I will give Biden some credit here, because I do think that in terms of Democratic politicians not breaking with neoliberalism, but at least attempting to pass policy that addresses some of its worst ills, I think he was like pretty successful, at least more so than many other politicians in my lifetime. But that doesn't cure the yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Liam.
No. Something to break in here, right? I mean, isn't there kind of an opportunity, and if we look at this in a systemic way, right? When you and I think we're both, before Trump, basically, right? The Democrats and the Republicans are both very centrist. There was people in the Democratic Party who would talk about doing pro-labor things, but the kind of worry was always then you're going to kind of lose out to the corporate money.
Yep.
So you'll lose an election if we actually try to go forward in any of these issues. And then Trump actually found a way to somehow make progress on some things. And now if he goes for tariffs, that's really going to be kind of amazing because it's a labor issue, right? This is essentially something that only labor parties have been asking for the last 30 years, which was, obviously not what the Democrats have been doing. NAFTA was the total opposite. Clinton passed it, right? So the thing is that the competition is no longer, right? I think it seems like Trump takes apart the Republican establishment. The Democrats sort of failed to realize it gives them an opportunity to do things for the working class that they could have done in the past. Rather, they seem to have said, well, let's just, grab the establishment and liberal voters. And what is that they ended up being seen as the party of the stagnant establishment and essentially being the party of this stagnant establishment, and then got destroyed, right, in a pretty serious way. Is Trump bringing the old Democratic Party down just like he brought the old Republican Party down? Is it sort of like impossible for them to go through the old Democratic playbook and win an election at this point?
Yeah, I mean, maybe again, prognosticating is at this point in my life it's sort of pointless. I do think that like the actual margin of victory is that it's always so small. Like even this, what feels like a wave election this time, we're talking about a couple 100,000 votes spread out across a few states. And basically, if like more Democrats had showed up to the polls, we might be talking about something entirely different. But that is no way to run a political system. Like we can't keep like attempting to win a sliver of people and hope that the world turns out fine. And I think I agree. You won't be surprised to hear that I agree with your thinking that if the Democrats continue to be the party of Jamie Dimon, then Jamie Dimon is going to not feel so bad when Donald Trump wins, and with his sort of faux populism. And I do think it's a faux populism. I think what will happen in a Trump administration will be tax cuts for rich people. Perhaps some chaotic tariffs that won't do the things that working class people want them to do, and who knows what else. But that's sort of the magic trick that he is pulling off. Is he sounds like he is of and for the working class while still just doing the bidding of the plutocrats. Unfortunately, the Democrats are sort of the party of the multicultural plutocrats, with like some occasional tinkering around the edges of what normal people care about. So,
So Steve, you've made a couple of kind of concrete suggestions as to what people should be doing. One of them is struggle to preserve the IRA, which seems very politically savvy. And the other, which Liam has brought in, is find an effective way of speaking more effectively to working class people. Don't get completely stuck inside the ghetto of identity politics and so-called wokeism, etc. I want to ask you about a third thing, which I know is on the minds of a lot of people in the Climate Majority Project, which is what about that tack to climate adaptation, which we touched on earlier. I mean, if you put it in terms of the deluge, is now the time for the sort of fierce blue fire outposts to start to get serious about being created? Is now the time for climate resilient cities, climate resilient states? I mean, could we imagine that there could be an impetus for parts of the country which are not wanting to become the next Asheville to
Right.
get serious? And could they be prompted to do that in part by the fear that because of this election result, tragically, the momentum on decarbonisation is, to say the least, not going to be continued for the foreseeable future? Would you advocate a attack towards an adaptation and resilience focus?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that, and let me try to address all of that. First of all, yeah, I mean, the reason I put that idea into the book was because of these hubs that are not only demonstrating like the power of zero carbon, of a zero carbon future, but are that actually doing things within the community. I mean, in the novel, it's they're working on drug addiction, and they're working on community resilience and agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. It would be great if somebody poured a ton of money into starting something like that. At the same time, we're having these fires in the States right now, in the Northeast in November, which is like it's wild. It's absolutely wild. And so there are dozens of communities right now that are watching their homes burn down from fires that nobody would have been prepared for. And whenever we talk about adaptation, it's like something to keep in mind that both in the climate crisis, one, there is no way to really prepare. And two, that's why we have to prepare nevertheless. Like, if there are organizations that can deliver aid, and I was talking to a woman whose family was originally from Asheville, and she and her brother drove down from New York with basically food and water, and spent several weeks just helping out their former neighbors, right? Like, of course, we need all of that. The other thing about working within our communities is that decarbonization is now, because of the advances in technology and how cheap everything is getting, it's now a community and household issue. So right now, still, before the IRA is in the middle of this big sort of political fight, the government's paying people to replace their gas furnace with a heat pump, to put solar panels and battery storage in their homes, to buy an electric vehicle. Like, that's the stuff that, if any Americans are listening, we should be like, if people are ready and can afford that stuff, that's what they should be going for right now, in terms of their household. In terms of their community, decarbonizing a town is a lot easier than decarbonizing a country. And it creates not only sort of these zero carbon hubs within the US, but also the political power, the jobs, the momentum, the working class momentum behind the project. And so I think thinking about ourselves on a community level is going to become vital, because that's where a lot of the work can still happen, even as Trump and the Republicans are in power.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant.
And then
Okay,
just one more
folks,
point.
we've got, yeah, sure.
Can I just make one more point, Rupert?
Yeah.
The other thing is, like, Washington State, their cap and invest program survived a ballot challenge. And so the project of decarbonization is going to keep moving along in the US because of our federalized system. There are a bunch of states that have the opportunity. They still have Democratic trifectas to push the pedal to the floor over the next few years. And we should be advocating for those states to do so.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've got a few minutes for questions for Steve. If anyone wants to raise their electronic hand, that would be the best way to do it, which is on the reactions button, and to unmute yourself. So we've got a question from Jack. Go ahead, Jack. Do unmute yourself.
So yeah, thank you, guys. Just my questions around having read the Deluge. It's amazing. Thank you, Stephen. There's the character of the pastor, who I don't want to give spoilers away, but feels like there's a lot of allusions with Trump in that character, and I wondered, in the recent election and in the future, to what extent do you see that kind of religiosity and evangelical Christianity playing a major role in US politics and climate politics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the freakiest thing was during this election when Trump came out with his own version of the Bible, his own sort of branded Trump Bible, which is more or less exactly what I had written into the novel with the pastor. So like there's again all these parallels that deeply freak me out. But yeah, I think sort of unheralded in this election is that Trump is powered by Christian nationalism, though he himself is sort of a pitiful sort of religious figure. Although he has that devotion of it. The Christian right has been instrumental in his rise to power, and they're not going anywhere. And I think every American, regardless of their faith or non-faith, should be incredibly worried about this situation, because Trump, look, he's going to be around one term. He is falling apart before our eyes. He's not going to be around forever. There's going to be somebody after him, and that person could very well be more coherent, more adept, and scarier. And that was sort of my thinking behind the creation of the pastor as a character. It's I think an enormous part of this that is going sort of unmentioned, even as he appoints judges and all the rest that are just going to do the bidding of that's faction.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Jack. Is there another question that someone in the audience has for Steve? Speak now or hold your peace.
I have a question.
Yes, who is that?
It's me,
Michael. Michael, hi.
Yeah, hello.
Go for it.
And hey, Steve, thank you for this great discussion. I appreciate that there's more of a sense of possibility in this discussion. I mean, not necessarily optimism, but at least maybe more openness in terms of what could happen. So I do appreciate that. I do want to ask, though, in terms of the prospects of potentially pushing the Democratic Party in a more progressive direction in this context. It seems like clearly the opportunity is there, and we need to seize it. Seize this moment of humiliation for the centrist Dems to like push this, push a different kind of politics. I'm also really worried, though, that the main lesson that many centrist Dems are going to take is that, we need to actually, shift to the right on these issues around like immigration, possibly even on climate. If that's what like this election might be seen as a sign, that's what the electorate wants. So we have to shift right, and it might even be a similar moment as the 90s with Clinton kind of adopting the right-wing consensus, and again, seeing just a shift of American politics to the right, but with a bit more, progressive economic policies in there. So I'm just curious, like, if I just like to hear you speak to that danger, if you think that's likely, and potentially how that might be combated.
Yeah, I mean, let me, because our conception of politics is so rigidly on the left-right spectrum. I feel like that is always sort of impacted the possibilities of thinking about politics. And there was this amazing graph that came out after the 2016 election that I think remains highly relevant to this day, which is sort of like, a quadrant, 4 quadrants of American political thought. And let's say, like, for shorthand, socially, like, most people fall into the spectrum of socially conservative and economically progressive. Like, they want healthcare for everybody. They want, public education. They want, a tax system that is not like insanely unfair, et cetera, et cetera. But they're a little nervous about things like immigration, things like, what we call wokeism, et cetera, et cetera. And neither party really services that quadrant. The Democratic Party sort of services, as socially liberal, still fairly economically conservative, but like more economically progressive than Republicans, et cetera, et cetera. And then the one that nobody likes is the Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney version of it, which is just like tax cuts for billionaires and social conservatism. And social liberalism. Nobody's in that block except for now the donors to the Democratic Party. Is everything I'm saying tracking? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, like, the challenge is to find these candidates who can win in states that are never going to be progressive in the ways that, like, graduates of the Iowa Writers Workshop might be progressive, right? And to find people who can sort of speak that language to working class people and who have those economically progressive ideas, but maybe aren't in accord with everybody on every single issue. The Democratic Party, not that I was ever a fan of blue dog Democrats, but at least it was a more diverse coalition. And I think that's what's hard for people to wrap their heads around, that like any successful political party has a more diverse coalition of not just like racially or from a gender perspective, but like, with ideas. And that keeps it healthy. The biggest majority the Democrats ever had was after Obama won in 2008. And that coalition was freaking impossible to hold together almost for anything. But it's because that range of opinion was so broad. But it did allow them to control 60 votes in the Senate and an overwhelming majority in the House, which looking back, oh my God, like how much wasted opportunity was there then? So yeah, I mean, it's an enormous challenge, but if the Democrats aren't looking for a way to speak to people where they are, we're really screwed.
Yeah. Great, Steve.
Thank
you so much. Thanks, Michael. We have a lovely long comment and question from Mandy in the chat. I'll just read out the question bit. Can you speak to what type of feelings or themes you want to focus on in any of your upcoming projects, Steve? I look forward to what you write next. That seems like a good question for us to end on, Steve. Can you say something about that?
I mean, I don't love to give away what I'm working on too much, but my next book is a collection of short stories, which will be a little bit more. It'll have a couple of ones that sort of speak more to our present circumstance, but it's also like a little more expansive and global and thinking about all of human existence, right? And then my novel is very much about the current moment, and I sort of unfortunately figured out how the book would feel on election night. I think what I want to write is something that's sort of it is not forward looking like the way the Deluge was, but that really speaks to the last, let's say 8, that will be 12 years, that speaks to this moment of crisis we're living through politically. And, as we look out across the world, I should also mention that the Trump phenomenon or the rise of the far right is not something that's confined to the States, and that everybody in Europe should be on guard as possible about what this means everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
The rise of authoritarianism, the rise of the far right, like this is not going anywhere anytime soon. And our voting and our advocacy has to be thoughtful and focused on that challenge that we're all living through right now.
Yeah. Steve, we need to let you go in a moment. I've got one slightly freaky thought for you before you go, which is coming back to Liam's wonderful question about what would Kate Morris say we should do now? What would be her pitch? Which is, of course, you sort of imagine in the novel a kind of AI version of that part of the story. I wonder if you could program Kate Morris's lines from the Deluge into one of these new AIs, and it could tell us what Kate Morris would say about our new moment here. Perhaps that will be part of the future of fiction and literature meeting politics. Steve, thank you so much. And as I said at the start, those of us who are most of us on this call, although there are people from the States on this call, I see, those of us who are not, you have our sympathies, obviously, and our solidarity. We're fearful for ourselves, but thank you for joining us and feeling able to share your feelings and thoughts on this difficult situation. I think it's already been super stimulating, and we're going to carry on now after you leave us.
Yeah, I'll just say thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having me. And I know this is believe me, such a dark time, and I've gone through all those waves. But the best part is we don't actually have time to despair. We don't have time to feel sorry for ourselves. The work continues. We all know it. We all know we owe it to ourselves and to everyone we love. So thank you for what you're doing, and I appreciate everyone.
Cheers, Steve. We'll be in touch.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. Liam, I want to turn to you and ask you for your reflections on that last 45 minutes that we had together. What do you make of where it takes us to?
Well, I mean, I guess I feel similarly as I have. I mean, I think similarly as a lot of people that, it's time to look for opportunities. And I do think, I'll say, in terms of prognostication, I remember one of the first times I got scolded for being too speculative was when I said, I think when I was 23 and when I was working in New York, that I thought some days the Democrats would probably lose the working class or like unions to the Republicans because they'd abandoned them so totally that the Republicans would find a way to capture the union vote. And it was like, yeah, there are some things which you see coming across, some opportunities which are building. And I think it's, what are these opportunities that are opened up by a genuine political realignment? I think it's a quite complex realignment. I think Trump, having been fought by the establishment for 4 years, been essentially, in most people's eyes, been attacked by the media, sometime in a quite unprincipled way. And that's one thing we didn't talk about, is that people, the January 6th story, how it just became one side of a story to so many people because the media was seen by so many people as just biased against Trump, right? It's not to say that like he doesn't deserve to be scrutinized for 4 years of January 6th. He convinced 35% of the population that a totally above level election was stolen, right? 35% of the electorate was convinced of that. That's how you undermine a democracy. He did it, right? But at the same time, what the kind of establishment almost did was take this, any means necessary approach. It's a bit like, the attitude that you would take towards, some type of, like the FBI took towards getting rid of Al Capone. We're going to get something on this person. We're going to make them stick. And that sort of backfired in a way where I think that they basically created the optics of the establishment against Trump. And now Trump has won. That's super chaotic, right? That
Yeah.
kind of image is really, really something, and now in order to actually do something about that, or that prospect is going to terrify a lot of the most powerful people in the United States, which means that a realignment is actually possible. So, I mean, it's both terrifying, but also we have to remember that kind of the entire upper strata of American society is terrified. There's no real telling what's actually possible in that political environment by way of a response. So I think we need to think very.
It's an interesting take. I don't know if I agree, though. We should go to the room in a second and see what others think, and we'll also turn in a moment to talk more about adaptation as promised. The reason I'm not sure I agree is because, of course, someone like Trump places the media in a very difficult position, and there is another way they could have gone, which in a way would have been even further in the direction that you're perhaps questioning, which is to have gone further down the track of saying of sort of super kind of fact checking and of saying, look, our job isn't to report what people say, our job is to report what's true. And one of the things that Trump trades off is that to some extent the media nowadays think their job is to report what people say and what is sensational rather than fact and truth. Are you muted?
The objection, Rupert, is that they didn't fact check all of the kind of Russian election interference. Like the FBI could never really produce any evidence to show that that was true, right?
Yeah.
And it's the fact that if you actually look at the latest prosecutions, like there are a number of people who are reputable lawyers who are say, well, this case that was brought against Trump, those cases don't actually happen a lot, right? It looks like two people like political prosecution or persecution. It looks like the Democrats, to a lot of voters, like what we worry Trump is going to do to his political opponents. Like people don't get the type of penalties thrown at him and the type of crimes that he committed around Stormy Daniels don't normally get that type of attention. That's been brought up by a number of reputable legal scholars, right? And that may be something. that really, costs Democrats ultimately, because it creates this idea. Like, the thing is, if you're not the type of person who looks at January 6th, like a very sophisticated kind of news analyst is going to say, look, there's absolutely no way he didn't know what was going on. He should have said something to stop. If he was responsible at all, he should have gotten those people to stop. We all know that he could have. Right. But if your mind doesn't go there, you're not 100% sure of that conclusion. And then he says, oh, well, I just wasn't really sure. And you can't sort of have a lot of faith in your logic to pull in that blank. And he says this, other thing. Well, I couldn't really do anything. It was just people out of control, nothing to do with me. Right. That's the other side of the story. It's not a very reputable side of this story, but you're not going to rely on the news media to tell you that there's only one side of the story if you've lost faith in it. So only 25% of the population actually trust the news media enough to allow them to say, yeah, there's just one side of the story here. Right. And that kind of.
Yeah, so maybe we're not disagreeing. I guess my thinking is there are some respects, for example, in relation to climate, where the media at large could have gone further than they have gone in terms of clarifying how completely irresponsible it is to take this person at their word. But and your point would then be, yeah, and that would be more possible if they hadn't kind of sullied their copybook in some ways by going too far in some particular respects where it wasn't justified.
Yeah, I mean, 25% is a low number, right? Like, you can't engage in complicated, intricate analysis that depends on people accepting a lot of facts they don't know from their own experience and expect you to move public opinion when you've got 25% support. That's what Pew polls say about trust in the media, right? And that's kind of the lesson here is the establishment can't deal with somebody like Trump because these establishment organs like the New York Times just do not change people's opinions anymore.
Yeah. Let's turn our thinking to the adaptation question, which we touched on a couple of times already on this call, and which was promised on the roster for this webinar. So I'll just make a couple of remarks about that, and then perhaps we'll throw it to the room again. So if we think of it briefly in terms of the kind of dark and difficult picture of our future, which Stephen Markley paints in The Deluge, albeit a picture where there are chinks of light in it, absolutely crucially as well. We might say in a quite straightforward way that what's happened at this election has catapulted us further in the direction of that future. And I guess it seems to me that this is another absolutely enormous wake-up call for the world, and that it's quite likely, and it seems to me to be already happening to some extent, that a lot of people are going to respond to this by saying, or even if they don't say it, feeling, right, so the idea that we're going to sort of get through this and there's going to be some kind of green transition is obviously to a large extent for the birds. We need to start looking after ourselves. And that, of course, is a big part of what adaptation means. So it seems to me that now is a critical moment for us all to get serious about doing adaptation and resilience building and doing it in the right way, that there is now more of an opportunity to do that than there was before, and more of a need to do that than there was before. And that gives us a kind of a task and an orientation. And this is what the Climate Majority Project is trying to encapsulate with our new campaign, which is Strategic Adaptation for Emergency Resilience, or SAFER. Well, yeah, it seems like the moment is propitious. And it would be very interesting to hear from those who are on the call what your take is on, well, what I just said, and what your take is on the moment in that regard. Is that how you are feeling? Have you noticed other people feeling or thinking something like that? What are the obstacles? What are the opportunities here in terms of moving in the direction of a big pivot towards climate adaptation of the right kind and at the right time, i.e. basically now and from now on? Anyone wish to say something or ask something that is in that kind of ballpark? Do put up your hand and or unmute. Greg?
This whole thing just leaves me thinking there's no more need now for politics. There's just what people need to do. And when people know they need to do it, which of course most people who are reasonable do, they just need to focalize on what those things are and not wait for politicians. I mean, if we can engage politicians, wonderful. As you know, I'm trying to do that for what I'm up to. But if people don't feel comfy with doing that and they don't feel trust in politics anymore, that's where they need perhaps some messaging through Safer that says, don't wait, be your own best guardian, be your own best lodestone, whatever you want to call it, and follow your own light in that way, because you know you're doing the right thing. Trust yourself and just do it.
Yeah.
Politics, just go without.
Very good, Greg. So that makes sense to me in terms of the way in which transformative and strategic adaptation type approaches can be quite naturally quite sort of commonsensical and non-partisan, because they're just about mutual protection in the face of a rising threat. Obviously, that we want the whole of the climate question, including decarbonization, to be seen similarly. But it's easy to see how it's easy to politicize decarbonization, at least compared to adaptation and preparedness. So yeah, maybe there's room for a big dose of a sort of return to common sense in the face of an emergency style threat in the basic adaptation frame. And that's a reason for optimism that we could succeed in breaking through way beyond the bubble by taking this kind of approach. Thank you. Peter, do you want to chime in here?
Yeah, thank you. Peter Love, calling from Toronto, Canada. Unfortunately, we're facing a politician that also has one-liners that thinks will solve big problems. Because I think that was a large part, I think, of what happened in the States. A very simple, clear, consistent, and resonating message that Trump had. He went off message a lot of times, but he did come back. I just want to comment. I wouldn't. I'm not sure we need to focus totally on adaptation. We do need to do more of it, but I think there's still a chance, and I think we have an opportunity for mitigation at the local and regional level, in both cities and states, provinces, regions. And we're going to be faced with the same thing in Canada, where we're going to have it looks like a prime minister who is certainly going to be much more friendly to the oil and gas industry than the current group in power. So that's just something we're going to have to deal with. But I think there's a lot that can be done at the local and regional level. And it's also going to be interesting to see the role that in large companies, especially high tech. Even some of the resource development companies who have made commitments and talked about wanting to move towards net zero, whether they keep that and whether they're going to be serious about it. And I think that, and that's where a role, I think, for consumers to be able to put pressure on the private sector to hold them to account and hold them to their promises. So it's going to, so I wouldn't, your question seemed to be implying that we should focus exclusively on adaptation, and I think that would be a mistake. I think we absolutely have to continue to mitigate as much as we can.
Yeah,
Knowing it may not be at the national level, at least in North America.
Yeah, absolutely. Otherwise, obviously, the emergency goes on getting worse forever, and in the end, you reach the limits to adaptation, which is why in strategic and transformative adaptation, it's kind of built in that they have to be mitigation friendly and creating win-wins. But I guess the point is partly about a change in framing. What if the framing is more to do with how do we create resilience, how do we protect ourselves, etc. And then you start perhaps with adaptation, resilience, preparedness measures, And then you sort of get people to realize, look, ultimately it's impossible to protect you or to protect ourselves unless we decarbonize as well, because the threat just keeps on growing if that's what we do. So what if we were to put sort of resilience and adaptation up front, as it were, rather than having them tailing along in the rear, which is the current way that these things tend to happen? What do you think of that, Peter?
I like this. I mean, I think people can hold two ideas at the same time, and I don't think you should lead with either. I think that they're not inconsistent with each other. To focus exclusive to put out adaptation first, to me is a way for people to sort of give up on trying to do anything about it, and all we can do is live with what's happening. And I don't think that's a message we want to give. I think we could position it that we really need to do both. We need to reduce the size of the problem and also deal with the problem that we're going to be facing. I think because they're not inconsistent, but I agree that in the past debate and dialogue has been really led by mitigation. How do we stop it? With adaptation a secondary role. And maybe I think I'd be more comfortable with the two of them being equally prominent. And I'm not sure you have to lead with one or the other.
I mean, I guess one thing I was prompted by was this idea that's in Steve's book of climate resilient cities, which is kind of leading with the adaptation side, and it does seem to me that has some credibility. And as I said in my question to him this evening, one could imagine in North America climate resilient states or climate resilient provinces.
Well, the thing, though, Rupert, you could also say we're happy to work with people who do lead with adaptation, right? So I mean, it could be our message that there's both these things. But if people are only ready for adaptation now, well, we're happy to work with you, and we think you're going to come out to the position that that's short-sighted. But we can work on that right now. That's also another way.
Yeah, good, nice. Thanks, Peter. Excellent. Anyone else want to chip in with a question or a comment from the progress of this discussion here this evening? Mark, welcome, Mark.
Hello, Robert. I'm just trying to analyze. I wonder how much the vote in the States was sort of a me first vote, a wee bit of individualism coming through, and I wonder where we could push back against that, and maybe through the journalists and the media. I'm a bit remembering I don't know who said it, the tongue-in-cheek comment. Let's put America first. Let's build up the walls and stop all this foreign weather. I mean that's that mindset of growing up, putting up the drawbridge and voting for America first. Well, that's people have to come to realize, and they will come to realize sooner or later. I'm afraid it's going to be a bit later at the minute, unless we can get some sort of media journalism narrative that we're really all in this together, and you can't withdraw inside the borders of the US or any other state and win the battles that are ahead of us. We need to think broadly, and that's where I'm worried about the downgrading of the COP that's currently started, and the fact that some heads of state haven't bothered to turn up. And I wonder, should the Climate Majority Project be seeking out friendly journalists to try and put these questions to people in all governments to say, hold on a minute, 2% growth or any sort of growth is not going to work. We need to be thinking much broader, things like the Bernie Sanders agenda of universal basic income, to give the average American voter a little bit of something that's going to be targeted towards them, rather than the elites and the people who've done very well out of the last neoliberal period, and get them to have the headspace to then think broader about the whole climate emergency that's facing us all, and they just don't quite realize that yet.
Interesting. Thanks, Mark. Liam, do you have any thoughts on what Mark's offered there?
Well, I mean, I do think going back to the adaptation framing, that's one of the charms of it, is that it is individual, right? People are trying to sort of do something about their own environment, but then find out pretty quickly if they go through a thought process that there's not a lot of way of avoiding that without making some type of deal with the whole world. And I think, I mean, the insurance markets that Steve talked about, if we want to get people to realize that more quickly, really focusing on that. I mean, one of the most hopeful developments is probably that economic shocks may happen sooner than the worst climate shocks, because economic markets anticipate the future. And we're just getting into the area where, if you look at like the present value of a current investment, this is going to get technical, but I think most people realize that. Obviously, it goes down by the interest rate, compounded every year. Well, the value of money 10 years from now is getting to be kind of like, well, after climate tipping points are actually, really here and causing major catastrophes, destroying, sinking whole cities underwater. That's actually, significant, a significant present value in today's financial system, whereas 30 years ago it wasn't, right? So that's actually like something that's getting every year felt more on balance books. There's a certain point at which future economic catastrophe starts being felt in the present value of assets, which is, a draconian way of putting it, but that means that economic shock may happen before the worst climate shocks happen, and people will feel that. And I think if our message sort of both targets the pocketbook and says that this collective thing is the cause of that, that may be a way of making it more real to people sooner, as well as obviously the changing weather.
But how do you get that sort of message onto the political debating programs? I mean, I love it when our friend George Monbiot gets onto a panel. He doesn't let any of the politicians wriggle out of facing real reality. He hits them with it between the eyes, and we don't have enough journalists really doing that. We have too many of them operating inside a very narrow Overton window, and that's just not doing the wider population any favors. Hiding the issues that they need to be confronted with, so they can get themselves out of that me first mindset that was behind the Trump vote. And that's worrying me.
Mark, may do. I mean, we have a forthcoming report. I think part of that may do with this idea that you're protecting people, or if you tell people the truth, then somehow people are just going to get depressed and stop acting. I think that's probably deeply mistaken. So if you look at media reticence, generally the Guardian is one of the few publications that is willing to platform people who are not very reticent. Not to say that the Guardian is perfect, but as media publications go, they're more likely to platform somebody like Bill McGuire than pretty much anybody else is. And that's largely because of this, I think, misguided idea that we don't want to alarm the public. They'll just get depressed, and then they'll stop acting. So part of that may be fighting back against that idea. So that's actually what we have partially on the agenda for next year, is really a report that takes on this myth and says, well, no, actually, what you need to be doing instead is creating the impression of the public that there is a wider movement, giving people some idea of what they could do personally, but also the faith that they're part of a wider social movement. So if they get very active right now, they're going to be part of a wave of action. And that may be really hard for people to hear after Trump. He's made our job harder in that way, but as Stephen's book says, there's a deluge. That's part of really the play of words in the title, is that this kind of
don't give it away, Liam.
Pressure of climate action, is building up. So it's not just the flooding, but the pressure of climate action is also coming. I think we have to create that reality for people in the public story, because if you do, then talking about the worst aspects of climate change and in public forums is motivating rather than just terrifying for people.
Right, I would agree with that. I think that's a good direction of travel. I would get behind that and support that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Great. And what Liam was referring to there was this series of reports for the Open Society Foundation, which we've been commissioned to write, which is very exciting. So this is something to watch out for. They'll be starting to come early in 2025. Right, we are approaching the end. So as promised, we're now going to bring in Chantal for a final perspective from a sort of psychological, shared resilience type perspective. Chantal will be familiar to some of you as a person in the Climate Majority Project who's been very involved, especially with the Climate Courage campaign, and is now working on shared inner work with businesses. Chantal, what do you make of this evening, and do you have any thoughts or reflections as to how people might go away from this call fortified, perhaps in the kind of way that Liam was gesturing at a moment ago?
Yeah, I think there are two things that really stood out for me actually listening. One is I felt that Stephen, while clearly being, very distressed about the situation, also spoke with a lot of humility about what we don't yet know. And I think that is incredibly important in terms of our psychological, psycho-spiritual health, if you like, and how we use that as a catalyst for moving forwards in, more positive ways in terms of adaptation. So I really heard, and I think that humility is incredibly important. And the other thing that I really just picked up on was something that Liam just said, which I've written about in Bulletproof to some degree, around the myth of panic. Thank you. Yeah. So obviously with Bulletproof, I'm trying to explode a lot of the myths that are very pervasive when it comes to resilience and our sort of inner capacity. And one of those myths is the myth of panic, is that when difficult things happen, we kind of spiral into some kind of crazy place where we can't function. Well, of course we can spiral, but we're also, we also have a psychological immune system, and that settles down and that gives us access to the wisdom and the grounding that we need. And I came up with this acronym the other day, GROUNDS, and the G is about grounded awareness, taking care of our inner climate, taking care of our ground of being, and doing that together as much as possible in community. And that includes the R of grounds, which is resisting fear-based manipulation, because I think, authority, especially with this sort of move towards far right and authoritarian movements, they prey so much on emotions and on emotional insecurity and general insecurity. And we have to learn to maintain enough clarity and perspective and sort of balance within ourselves to avoid that the manipulation of very fear-based rhetoric. So, and that includes remembering and relearning that we can handle the truth, that we are innately resilient. The O is about being open-minded and fostering more conscious, humble leadership, to be able to sit in uncertainty, to be able to sit in not knowing, and use that space as a place to create from and to inspire adaptation and community building. So living with an awareness, which I really heard in what Stephen said, also an awareness of what we don't yet know, but not in a way that fosters fear, but in a way that keeps us humble and eager to keep going no matter what. The U of grounds is about understanding ourselves and others, which is really about listening, moving away from othering, which we talk about a lot, moving away from labeling and dehumanizing those who have a different worldview, even if that worldview seems, completely terrible to us in the moment. What is it that really matters to people? How can we listen better and more compassionately? And the N is actually about nurturing compassion and kindness, reducing our dependency on kind of strongman leadership, which we can turn to when we feel like there's nothing to hold on to, but really grounding ourselves in more compassionate inquiry and deeper listening. And the D is dedication, dedicating ourselves, which I think is what a lot of people are doing more and more, to life, all of life, and to living and inspiring a Utopia, really, inspiring a more positive vision of what we can create together, focusing on very inclusive and constructive change, a more unified and less polarized society, which I know the CMP is very dedicated to, and solutions that come from a place of cooperation and compassion rather than anger and revenge, so that we can sort of shift our energy in the way that we move going forwards. And the S of grounds, which I think is becoming really, really so important, is to strengthen our more critical thinking. So self-awareness of our own thought habits, our own biases, our own patterns, our emotional triggers, so that we can be less victimized by our own patterns, and have that awareness to be able to move through those difficult moments. So those are some of the things I've been thinking about, and might turn that into something more visual at some point, if it's helpful. But yeah, it's just yeah.
Wow, that was beautiful, Chantal, and a really great way to bring us towards a close here. We have grounds for some kind of embodied active hope for going forward together, folks. You heard it here first. And that keeps us grounded as well, in a good way. You know, the term grounded, you've got to be careful with. It doesn't mean grounded like you're a school kid and you can't go out. The other kind of grounded.
Well, there is that too, if you're naughty. I'll put you on. There is that too, Rupert.
Gosh, okay, that's it. I wasn't ready for that. We'll have to come back to that another time. We are coming towards the end here, folks. Thank you so much for staying with us during this Climate Majority Thinks webinar, one of what is proving, I think, quite a successful series. You can find the others on our website, and I think one or two of them are going to be put in the chat in a moment here. I also want to announce what's been in the chat, some upcoming events. So we have got Climate Majority Project Tea next week, or Tuesday the 19th at 3:30. And this happens about once a month. It's an online event where we encourage people to come along with a cup of tea and talk about something together, just to chat it through informally. And this next one next week is going to be very relevant. It's about reaching the climate majority and stepping outside the bubble. And how we do that, and building on things we've been talking about on this evening's call, I'm sure. And this is in the chat as well, we're going to have Climate Majority Pints in person in London at the Three Johns pub again on Wednesday, the 27th of November. And these events are proving very successful, gathering people in the evening for a drink at a really high quality pub with really high quality beer. I've got to tell you, if you haven't been yet. So if you're in the Greater London area and you can make it to that, do come along to that. And just to trail that, in 2025, we will be doing one or two CM Pints events elsewhere in Britain, including up there in the north, where I know that some of you reside. I don't mean the north of Ireland, I mean the north of England, but that's still quite a long way from where some of us are sitting right now. Although, did you know, I live in Norfolk, folks. Did you know that Norwich is north of Birmingham? Not a lot of people know that. It's because the whole of Britain is sort of on the tilt. Anyway, I think we're naturally coming towards the end of today's call. Liam, any very final remark from you?
No, thank you. And thanks, Chantal. That was a lovely way of rounding it off.
Yeah, it really was. Thanks so much, Chantal. Thanks, everybody. We'll leave the call open for a minute or two. Feel free to unmute yourself and say things or whatever you want to do. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next one of these. Do also bear in mind you can all save the chat for yourself if you wish to do so by going into the chat box and pressing the save chat button. Thanks, everyone. Good evening to you, and onwards.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Look forward to
everyone.
seeing you again, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Nice to see you all up there.